When people think about dictators, they usually imagine speeches, military uniforms, and political. But what often gets ignored are the strange personal routines behind the scenes. What did these people eat? How did they sleep? Did they exercise? Did they drink heavily? What were their relationships like? And few dictators had a lifestyle more bizarre than Uganda's brutal ruler, Idi Amin. A former boxer, a military giant standing over 6 feet 4 inches tall, and a man feared by millions. But behind the terrifying image was someone obsessed with food, strength, women, power, and spectacle. Today, we're looking at the daily habits of Idi Amin, from his diet and exercise routines to his drinking, sleeping patterns, relationships, and work ethic. And some of it sounds almost unbelievable. Early habits, built like a fighter. Before becoming dictator of Uganda, Idi Amin was known for one thing above all else: his physical strength. As a young man, he worked manual labor jobs before joining the British colonial military force called the King's African Rifles. And physically, Amin stood out immediately. He was massive, strong, naturally athletic. In the 1950s, he became Uganda's heavyweight boxing champion, a title he reportedly held for nearly a decade. That boxing background shaped many of his lifelong habits. Even after becoming ruler, Amin remained obsessed with physical dominance and masculinity. He reportedly exercised regularly, especially in his earlier years in power. Former associates described him swimming frequently, walking around military compounds, and sometimes engaging in informal boxing or wrestling demonstrations with soldiers. He loved appearing physically intimidating. And unlike many world leaders who became soft after gaining power, Amin seemed deeply concerned with maintaining the image of a warrior. That image became central to his identity. Amin's diet, huge portions and constant eating. Idi Amin's eating habits were legendary. Reports from former staff and diplomats describe him consuming enormous quantities of food every day. His meals often centered around meat, goat, beef, chicken, fish. Large portions of traditional Ugandan foods like matoke, which is cooked green banana, were reportedly staples in his diet. He also loved rich stews and heavily prepared meals. Visitors often described state dinners overflowing with food, while Uganda itself suffered severe economic collapse and shortages. Amin reportedly ate frequently throughout the day and was known to demand meals at odd hours. As his rule progressed, his weight noticeably increased. By the late 1970s, he was significantly heavier than during his boxing years. And several reports from people around him suggested he had an enormous appetite combined with very little restraint. Food for Amin wasn't just nourishment. It was power. Huge meals became part of the royal image he wanted to project. A ruler who could consume endlessly while everyone around him obeyed. Drinking habits, alcohol, and excess. Despite his military image, Amin reportedly drank heavily at times. Accounts vary depending on the source, but many diplomats and former officials claimed he enjoyed alcohol regularly, especially later in his rule. Whiskey was commonly mentioned, so was champagne during official events. Some reports described long nights involving drinking with military officers and guests, while political decisions were made unpredictably. That unpredictability became one of the defining characteristics of his regime. People around him often had no idea what mood he would be in from one hour to the next, and alcohol may have intensified that instability. However, unlike some dictators who were constantly publicly intoxicated, Amin often tried to maintain the appearance of control and toughness. The image mattered to him, even when his private behavior suggested chaos, smoking, and drug use. Interestingly, compared to many powerful figures of the 20th century, Amin was not especially known for heavy smoking. There are occasional reports of cigar smoking or social smoking, but tobacco doesn't appear to have been a defining part of his lifestyle. Drug use is harder to verify. There have been rumors and speculation over the years regarding stimulant use or medication abuse, but historians generally caution against making definitive claims without evidence. What is documented, however, is Amin's increasingly erratic behavior during his years in power. His speeches became bizarre, his decision-making became impulsive, and his paranoia intensified dramatically. Whether that came from stress, isolation, alcohol, mental instability, or a combination of factors remains debated. Women, marriages, and relationships. One of the most notorious aspects of Idi Amin's personal life was his relationships with women. Amin reportedly had at least 5 wives officially, along with numerous affairs and unofficial relationships. At one point, he publicly announced divorces over national radio. That gives you an idea of how theatrical and controlling he was. Women around Amin often lived in fear. Several of his wives allegedly suffered abuse, intimidation, and violence, and some disappeared under suspicious circumstances. One of the darkest examples involved his wife Idi Amin, whose death remains deeply controversial and horrifying. For Amin, relationships often appeared tied to ownership and power rather than affection. He projected hypermasculinity constantly: military uniforms, public displays of confidence, boastful speeches, claims about strength and virility. Everything seemed designed to reinforce the image of an untouchable strongman. Sleep and daily routine. Like many authoritarian rulers, Amin reportedly kept irregular hours. Former officials described him holding late-night meetings and making sudden demands at unpredictable times. That unpredictability was intentional. It kept subordinates nervous and constantly available. Some reports suggest he slept relatively little during periods of political tension, especially during military operations or moments of paranoia. But other accounts describe long stretches of leisure, luxury, and inactivity. As his regime became more isolated from reality, Amin appeared increasingly disconnected from ordinary life in Uganda. He surrounded himself with loyalists, military guards, and extravagant displays of authority. Meanwhile, the country itself was collapsing economically. Work ethic, energetic but chaotic. One of the strangest contradictions about Idi Amin was that he could appear incredibly energetic while also being deeply disorganized. He often inserted himself into military matters personally. He enjoyed surprise appearances, public ceremonies, and dramatic speeches. Some diplomats who met him said he could be charismatic, funny, and oddly charming in person. That unpredictability made him even more dangerous, because behind the charisma was brutality. Under Amin's rule, hundreds of thousands of Ugandans were killed. Political opponents disappeared. Ethnic groups were targeted. Fear became part of daily life. And despite the image of strength, many historians believe Amin governed impulsively rather than strategically. His decisions were often emotional, reactive, and driven by paranoia. The collapse. By the late 1970s, Amin's lifestyle had become increasingly detached from reality. Uganda's economy was in ruins. International pressure was growing, and his inner circle became consumed by fear and instability. In 1979, Amin was finally overthrown after a war with Tanzania and Ugandan exiles. He fled the country and eventually settled in Saudi Arabia, where he lived quietly for decades. And strangely, after years of ruling through terror and spectacle, his final years were relatively private. He died in 2003 at the age of around 78. Final thoughts. What makes Idi Amin fascinating and disturbing is the contradiction. He obsessed over physical strength, but ruled through fear. He projected confidence while becoming increasingly paranoid. He lived with excess while his country suffered, and his daily habits reflected all of it. The huge meals, the obsession with masculinity, the chaotic routines, the late-night unpredictability, the need for control and spectacle. It all mirrored the psychology of his regime. Because in many cases, the private habits of dictators tell you something important about how they govern publicly. And Amin may be one of the clearest examples of that in modern history.